Lead Toxicology by Brian Dorn for American Public University. Elemental lead is highly abundant. It's a heavy metal that is naturally occurring in the environment. It's been used in products like gasoline, cosmetics, ceramics, paint, batteries, and piping systems around the world. Examples of products containing lead. In the 1920s, tetraethyl lead was added to gasoline as an anti-knock agent. By the 1960s, 90% of gas sold contained lead. In the mid-1900s, no one doubted that high blood lead levels above 80 micrograms per deciliter could severely damage a child, but there was little research to show what lead level was actually dangerous. In 1979, pediatrician Herbert Needleman became the first major advocate for the removal of lead products. He led a team of researchers to study the effects of lower lead levels in 3,000 children by the analysis of their baby teeth. High levels averaged 36 micrograms per deciliter. Low levels averaged 24. The study concluded that children exposed to lower levels from dental work were subject to poor mental performance. The removal of lead from gasoline. From 1976 to 1980 to 2015 to 2016, the mean blood lead levels in people aged 1 to 74 decreased 12.8 to 0.82 micrograms per deciliter, a decline of 93.6%. The blood lead levels of the average American children dropped from 15 micrograms per deciliter in the late 70s to 2.7 micrograms per deciliter in the early 90s, and it's even lower today. By 2000, 8 major studies were published, 6 of which concluded the harmful effects of lead in children at exposures below 10 micrograms per deciliter. It was conclusive that a loss of 6.9 IQ points was associated with increasing blood lead levels from 2.4 to 30 micrograms per deciliter. The CDC now associates blood lead levels of 5 micrograms per deciliter as a reference, requiring mandatory notification to parents at this level. While these regulations have decreased childhood exposures, existing materials, paint products, imports, and water quality issues remain a threat to children in the U.S. The Flint water crisis was made famous in 2015 through worldwide media coverage. The switch from the Detroit water supply to their own source was against the advice of professionals and without consideration for the public. What went wrong? April 2014, the city switched the water source without considering the possible effects to the public. During water testing, 10% of the water tests failed, showing lead levels above 25 parts per billion, well over the EPA's standard of 15 parts per billion. The city officials still stated the water was within standards. City officials in the local health department argued everything was fine. When confronted by the pediatricians, doctors eventually concluded that reportable blood lead levels doubled in children aged 5 and younger. The city finally announced they would return to the Detroit water source in October 2015. As a result, 12 people died and 12,000 children were exposed to high lead levels in the water. Mazur 2017 argued that blood lead levels in these children were much lower than those in the 1970s. While these findings could have eased the concerns of many parents in Flint, Michigan, the extent of the damage differed on a case-by-case basis. In the 1960s, the CDC considered blood lead levels of 60 micrograms per deciliter or more to be high. This was lowered to 30 in the 70s, 25 in the 80s, 10 in the 90s, and resides at 5 micrograms per deciliter today. History of the lead ban in the United States. Continued problems from lead exposure. Primary routes of exposure are inhalation and ingestion. drinking water systems containing lead piping and components. Although banned by the US EPA in 1978, lead paint products still exist in many houses and buildings constructed before that time. Many countries in the world still use lead paint and products, making exposure extremely difficult to detect. There is a lack of research about how environmental knowledge and resources surrounding lead poisoning could be made available to the urban youth today. How lead affects the body. Lead mimics calcium and other divalent functions. Lead produces a cytotoxic reactive oxygen species affecting multiple organ systems, developmental problems, and for this reason is especially toxic to children and unborn fetuses. Effects of lead exposure in children. Most exposures are chronic because lead accumulates in the body over time. According to the EPA, low levels of lead in children can result in behavioral and learning problems, lower IQ and hyperactivity, slowed growth, hearing problems, and anemia. In rare cases, ingestion of lead can cause seizures, coma, and even death. Chelation therapy can be used to treat lead poisoning. EDTA is injected into the bloodstream to bind with the lead and discard it through the kidneys. The treatment itself is controversial, except for in cases of lead poisoning. In some cases, heart failure and kidney problems result. As a result, it's not recommended for use in children. The best defense for lead poisoning is to avoid exposure. The end.